Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. Let me start with something simple but uncomfortable. There are two Americas, not red America and blue America, not urban and rural, not coastal or heartland. I mean something deeper than that. There are two Americas that have always existed in tension with each other. One is the America that exists on paper, the one laid out in 1776 and 1787. The America of ideals, of theory, of aspiration. The other is the America we actually live in, the one shaped by power, incentives, fear, and human behavior. And the distance between those two Americas, that's the story of this country. It always has been. But right now, that distance is widening in ways that should alarm anyone who still takes the founding ideals seriously. Because what we're watching isn't just political dysfunction. It's structural drift. It's institutional decay. And it's happening in plain sight. To understand where we are, you have to go back to what this country actually set out to be. Start with the Declaration of Independence. Not as a piece of symbolism, not as something you hear quoted on the 4th of July, but as what it actually is, an indictment. The Declaration is not a governing document. It doesn't tell you how the system works. It tells you why the system had to change. It is a list of grievances against a king who had consolidated power, a king who had corrupted institutions, a king who had placed himself above the law, and the core idea running through that document is simple but radical. Legitimacy flows upward from the people, not downward from a ruler. That's it. That's the whole thing. Government exists because the people allow it to exist. And when it stops serving the people, when it becomes destructive of their rights, it is not just their right to change it, it is their duty. That's not reformist language. That's revolutionary language, literally. Now, fast forward 11 years. You get the Constitution. And the Constitution is something different. It's not an indictment. It's a blueprint. A system designed to prevent the exact abuses the Declaration was written about. No king. No unchecked authority. No single point where power can accumulate without resistance. Instead, you get friction. You get competing institutions. You get ambition counteracting ambition. And here's the key thing the founders understood, something we've largely forgotten. They did not assume virtue. They assumed the opposite. They assumed people in power would push boundaries, exploit loopholes, and act in their own interest. So they didn't design a system that required good people. They designed a system that could survive bad ones. Or at least that was the idea. Now look at where we are today. Because the gap between that design and our reality is where things start to break down. Start with the presidency. The modern presidency is almost unrecognizable compared to what was imagined in 1787. Over time, decade by decade, crisis by crisis, the offices accumulated power. Emergency authorities layered on top of emergency authorities. Expansive interpretations of national security. Executive orders used not as tools of administration, but as instruments of policy making. And all of it sitting inside a political culture that increasingly treats the presidency like an elected monarchy. We don't talk about presidents as constrained actors inside a system anymore. We talk about them as singular forces, as saviors, or threats, but always as the center of gravity. That's not an accident. That's a shift. Now look at Congress, because in theory, Congress is supposed to be the branch closest to the people. It's the most representative, the most responsive, the place where competing interests are supposed to collide and produce compromise. In practice, it's the most dysfunctional. And that's just not because of polarization. It's structural. Gerrymandering has eliminated real electoral competition in huge swaths of the country, especially in the House. Most members are not worried about losing a general election. They're worried about losing a primary, which means their real audience is not the broader public. It's the most engaged and often most extreme slice of their own party. So what gets rewarded? Not compromise, not legislating, performance, conflict, attention. And the legislative process itself is hollowed out and broken down. Major bills are written by leadership, negotiated behind closed doors, proposed dropped on the floor with minimal time for review. Voted on as loyalty tests rather than deliberative decisions. The branch that was designed to check power now often just facilitates it. Then there's the judiciary. And here the issue isn't just power, it's legitimacy. Courts only function if people believe they are applying law, not politics. That perception matters as much as the rulings themselves. And that perception has been eroding. You have lifetime appointed judges making sweeping decisions on elections, rights, and regulation. And those decisions increasingly track the preferences of the political coalitions that put them there. Whether that perception is fully fair or not is almost beside the point, because once people stop believing the courts are neutral arbiters, law stops feeling like law. It starts feeling like another extension of factional conflict. And when that happens, compliance becomes conditional. Now layer something else on top of all of this. Corruption. Not just the obvious kind. Not just envelopes of cash or explicit quid pro quos. But the more insidious version. The one the founders were actually most worried about. The blending of public power and private interest. Access becomes something you can buy. Policy outcomes begin to track the preferences of the wealthy and the well-connected. Influence concentrates, and the system starts to tilt, not through dramatic violations, but through quiet, persistent distortion. The founders had a word for this. They called it faction, and they were obsessed with it. They feared that concentrated interests would capture the machinery of government and bend it to their will. Their solution wasn't to pretend factions wouldn't exist. It was to design a system where no single faction could dominate. A large republic, competing interests, institutional friction. But all of that depends on something we've allowed to weaken. A shared commitment to the legitimacy of the system itself. Because here's the thing. None of these structures, none of them, work if the people inside them stop believing in the rules. If elections become optional obstacles instead of binding outcomes, if losing is treated not as a signal to adjust, but as justification to delegitimize the process, if public officials test the limits of law, assuming there will be no consequences, then the entire architecture starts to come apart. And it doesn't collapse all at once. That's not how this works. It erodes, gradually. Norms weaken. Precedents shift. Each escalation justifies the next one. What used to be unthinkable becomes controversial. What used to be controversial becomes normal. And eventually, you look up and realize the system is operating on entirely different assumptions than the ones it was built on. And that brings us to where we are right now. Because what we're seeing isn't just erosion. It's something more aggressive. The use of the state itself to legitimize a lie. According to reporting, the FBI has launched a sweeping effort tied to the 2020 election in Georgia. Hundreds of personnel, agents, analysts, support staff, being directed to review ballots and election records from Fulton County in 2020. This follows an earlier raid on a local elections office, and all of it is connected to claim that has already been investigated, litigated, and debunked over and over again, that the 2020 election was stolen. There is no credible evidence for that claim. There never has been. And yet here we are, with federal law enforcement resources being deployed, not to uncover wrongdoing, but to re-examine a settled outcome. Why? Because one man refuses to accept defeat. And this is the line you don't cross in a functioning republic. You don't take the machinery of law enforcement and aim it at a conspiracy theory just because it's politically useful. You don't treat baseless claims as grounds for investigation. You treat them as disqualifying because the rule of law is supposed to be anchored in facts, in evidence, in reality, not in grievance, not in ego, not in the personal obsessions of a political leader. When that line blurs, when the system starts chasing narratives instead of truth, you're no longer operating under the rule of law. You're operating under something else. Here's the broader consequence. It's not just about 2020. It's not just about Georgia. It's about what happens to a system when losing an election stops being acceptable. In a healthy democracy, elections resolve conflict. They don't eliminate it, but they channel it. You win, you govern. You lose, you regroup. You try again. That's the cycle. But if losing becomes intolerable, if it becomes something that must be explained away, overturned, or retroactively invalidated, then elections stop functioning as stabilizing mechanisms. They become flashpoints, and eventually they become meaningless. Because why have a system for transferring power if one side refuses to recognize the outcome? Now, to be clear, the America of the Declaration and the Constitution has never been fully realized, not even close. It excluded more people than it included. It tolerated injustices that directly contradicted its own principles. It embedded compromises on slavery, on representation, on citizenship that have shaped everything that came after. That's all true. But it also articulated a standard, a claim about equality, about liberty, about self-government. And that claim became the foundation for every expansion of rights that followed. Every movement, every reform, every push to make the country live up to its own expectations and ideals. The question has never been whether we fall short. We always have. The question is whether we're still trying to close the gap, or whether we started moving the opposite direction. And what's happening right now suggests acceleration in the wrong direction. Because instead of protecting election workers from harassment, instead of reinforcing confidence in the system, instead of focusing on future integrity, we're redirecting resources toward relitigating the past, toward validating a narrative that has already failed every factual test. And that matters, because systems don't just break when rules are violated. They break when reality itself becomes negotiable, when truth becomes subordinate to power. The founders understood something that we tend to forget. A republic is not self-sustaining. It doesn't run on autopilot. It requires vigilance. It requires constraint. It requires people, both voters and leaders, who are willing to prioritize long-term stability over short-term advantage. And when that breaks down, the system doesn't just wobble, it degrades. You can see that degradation in Congress. You can see it in the courts. You can see it in the presidency. And now you can see it in the willingness to use federal law enforcement to chase a predetermined conclusion. At a certain point, something else happens. The language we use to describe the system, equality, consent to the governed, checks and balances, rule of law, those words stop in functioning as descriptions and start functioning as artifacts. Remnants of an earlier version of the country, a version that aspired to something better, but no longer operates that way in practice. And that brings us back to where we start. Two Americas, one defined by its ideals, the other by its reality. The tension between them has always been there, but it was supposed to be productive. It was supposed to drive progress, to push the system closer to what it claimed to be. What we're seeing now is something different. Not tension, but divergence. Not friction, but separation. The United States was founded in resistance to a king who placed himself above the law. That was the whole point, that no one, not even the most powerful person in the system, would be beyond accountability. And yet now, we're dealing with a presidency that increasingly operates on the assumption that law should bend to will, that institutions should serve personal grievance, that investigations should produce preferential narratives, not discovered objective truth. The system was designed to prevent this. It was designed with the expectation that someone like this would eventually come along, and that the structure itself would hold. But structures only work if people are willing to enforce them, if they're willing to say no, if they're willing to accept limits, if they're willing to prioritize the system over the individual. And when too many people decide not to, when loyalty replaces accountability, when power becomes the only organizing principle, then the constraints start to fail. And that's the moment we're in. Not at the end of the story, but in a phase where the outcome is no longer guaranteed, where the distance between the two Americas is no longer just a source of tension, but a measure of how far the system can stretch before it breaks. So the question isn't whether we've fallen short of the founding ideals. We always have. The question is whether those ideals still function as a guide, or whether they've become a cover story for something else entirely. Because once that shift happens, once the language stays the same, but the reality underneath it changes, you don't just have a flawed republic, you have something different. And history suggests that once you cross that line, it's very hard to go back. Keep up the good fight. Remember our principles and live by them. And force the powers that be to live by them as well. This has been America's Fractured Politics. Until next time, I'm your host, Mark Mansour.